In a quiet town in the Midwest where life usually moved at a slow pace, something happened that shook everyone to their core. It was one of those nights where the streets were empty, the air was cold, and most people were already tucked in their beds. But for one man, this night would change everything. This man was a federal prosecutor, a person whose job was to make sure justice was served. He worked hard every day, standing up for what was right, especially when it came to holding bad cops accountable. Over the years, he had built a reputation as someone who didn't back down, no matter how tough things got. People respected him, but not everyone liked him. Some police officers felt threatened by his work because he wasn't afraid to expose corruption or abuse of power. And that's where the trouble began. On this particular night, the prosecutor was driving home after a long day at the office. The roads were deserted, and the only sound was the hum of his car engine. As he approached a quiet intersection, red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind him. His heart sank. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any stop signs, and hadn't broken any rules. Still, he pulled over, turned off his engine, and waited. The officer who walked up to his window was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an air of authority. This wasn't just any officer. It was someone with a history. For years, there had been whispers about this man, complaints from citizens about rude behavior, accusations of using too much force during arrests, and even rumors of racist remarks. None of these complaints ever seemed to stick, though. Every time someone spoke out, the case was dismissed and the officer walked away unscathed. When the officer leaned into the car, things started off normally enough. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked in a gruff voice. The prosecutor shook his head and politely replied, "No, sir, I don't." But then, something shifted. The tone of the conversation changed. What started as a routine question quickly turned into hostility. The officer began making comments, nasty, hurtful ones, that made it clear this wasn't about traffic laws anymore. It was personal. The prosecutor tried to stay calm. He knew better than to argue with someone in uniform, especially late at night on a lonely road. But the officer wasn't satisfied. Words weren't enough for him. In a sudden burst of anger, he yanked open the car door and dragged the prosecutor out onto the pavement. Witnesses later said they heard shouting, thuds, and cries of pain echoing through the darkness. By the time anyone could react, the damage was done. The prosecutor lay crumpled on the ground, bloodied and unconscious. His body bore the marks of a brutal beating, broken bones, cuts, and swelling that would leave lasting scars. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but it took them a while to stabilize him. They feared the worst. Would he survive? Even if he did, would he ever fully recover? News of the attack spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with outrage. How could this happen? Why would a police officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, do such a thing? People demanded answers. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice now and no more abuse." The prosecutor's colleagues in the legal community were horrified. They knew him as a dedicated public servant, someone who fought tirelessly for fairness and equality. To see him treated this way was unthinkable. But beyond the headlines and hashtags, there was a deeper story unfolding. This wasn't just about one man or one night. It was about years of tension between law enforcement and the communities they were supposed to protect. It was about trust being broken and promises left unfulfilled. And now, with the prosecutor fighting for his life in a hospital bed, the entire nation was watching. Doctors worked around the clock to save him, but the road ahead looked uncertain. If he survived, what kind of future awaited him? Could he ever go back to his old life, or would the injuries leave him permanently disabled? These questions weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Yet even in the midst of chaos, there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this tragedy could spark real change. After all, sometimes it takes a single moment, a single act of injustice to wake people up and push them toward action. As days turned into weeks, the prosecutor remained in critical condition. Visitors came and went, offering prayers and words of encouragement. Among them were friends, family, and fellow lawyers who vowed to fight for justice on his behalf. Outside the hospital, the protests continued, growing louder and more determined with each passing day. The prosecutor's name became synonymous with resilience, a symbol of the battle against systemic racism and police brutality. And so, the stage was set for what would become one of the most talked about cases in recent history, a case that would test the limits of justice, challenge deeply ingrained biases, and force society to confront uncomfortable truths. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey, one that would leave an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of millions. The prosecutor's condition remained touch and go for weeks. Doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him, but the injuries he sustained were severe. His head injury was particularly concerning. Swelling in his brain had left him in a coma, and there were fears that even if he woke up, he might never be the same again. Broken ribs made it painful for him to breathe, and fractures in his arms and legs meant he wouldn't walk anytime soon, if ever. For someone who had spent years standing tall in courtrooms, fighting for justice with passion and determination, this sudden fragility felt unbearable. His family barely left his side. His wife sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand and whispering words of encouragement. "You're strong," she told him softly, her voice trembling. "You've always been strong. You can fight this." Their children visited every day after school, drawing pictures and leaving cards they hoped he'd see when he woke up. Friends from work came too, bringing updates about cases he had been handling before the attack. They didn't want him to feel forgotten or left behind, even though he couldn't respond. Outside the hospital, the public reaction grew louder. News outlets covered every detail of the case, from the prosecutor's medical updates to the growing protests demanding accountability. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Injustice Forum and No More Silence. People shared stories of their own encounters with police misconduct, flooding comment sections and threads with raw emotion. It was clear this wasn't just about one man, it was about years of frustration boiling over. Meanwhile, the officer involved in the incident doubled down on his story. He claimed self-defense, saying the prosecutor had resisted arrest and become aggressive, but no one bought it. Witnesses who lived near the scene came forward, describing what they saw or heard that night. One neighbor said she was startled, awake by shouting, and looked out her window just in time to see the officer dragging the prosecutor out of his car. Another recalled hearing a thud followed by cries of pain. None of these accounts matched the officer's version of events. As more evidence surfaced, cracks in the officer's story began to show. Surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store captured part of the altercation. The grainy video didn't show everything, but it was enough to raise serious questions. In the footage, the prosecutor appeared calm as he pulled over, stepping out of his car only after the officer instructed him to do so. There was no sign of resistance, no indication that he posed a threat. Instead, viewers could see the officer lunging at him, pinning him against the car, and then pulling him to the ground. What happened next wasn't visible, but the sounds that followed, grunts, groans, and muffled screams, spoke volumes. The prosecutor's colleagues in the U.S. Attorney's Office refused to stay silent. They knew him not just as a co-worker, but as a friend, a man who dedicated his life to protecting others. They organized press conferences, speaking out against the attack and calling for transparency. "This isn't just an isolated incident," one of them said during a televised interview. "It's part of a pattern. We need to hold people accountable when they abuse their power, especially when they wear a badge." But accountability wasn't easy to come by. Despite the mounting evidence, there were still those who defended the officer. Some argued that he was simply doing his job, while others dismissed the prosecutor's injuries as exaggerated. Online, forums lit up with heated debates, dividing communities further. Supporters of the prosecutor pointed out the hypocrisy. How could anyone claim the officer acted in self-defense when the victim was unarmed and outnumbered? Critics countered by accusing the prosecutor of playing the victim card, suggesting he brought the attack on himself by targeting law enforcement in his work. Amid the chaos, the prosecutor's family struggled to keep hope alive. Every day felt like a roller coaster. Moments of optimism followed by crushing setbacks. When doctors finally announced that the swelling in his brain had gone down, they allowed themselves to celebrate, even if just for a moment. But the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. Even if he woke up, there was no guarantee he'd regain full cognitive function. Could he return to his career? Would he recognize his loved ones? These questions haunted everyone close to him. Despite the uncertainty, the prosecutor's resolve became a rallying cry for change. Advocacy groups seized the opportunity to push for reforms, organizing marches and petitions aimed at addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. School teachers used the case as a teaching moment, encouraging students to think critically about fairness and equality. Artists painted murals honoring the prosecutor, turning blank walls into powerful statements of resilience and hope. And yet, through all the noise and activity, one thing remained constant: the prosecutor himself. Lying motionless in his hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped steadily in the background, he was a reminder of how fragile life could be, and how much strength it took to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Slowly, but surely, signs of progress emerged. After weeks in a coma, the prosecutor began showing small signs of improvement. His eyelids fluttered open briefly, and though he couldn't speak, his family noticed moments of recognition. A squeeze of the hand here, a faint smile there. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reignite their faith. Physical therapy sessions started once he was stable enough to move, each session grueling but necessary. Progress was slow, measured in inches rather than miles, but it was progress nonetheless. By now, the case had captured national attention. Talk shows invited experts to discuss police reform, while late-night hosts joked darkly about the absurdity of defending brutality. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing accountability for officers accused of misconduct. Activists pushed harder than ever, knowing this was their chance to make lasting change. Through it all, the prosecutor's story served as both a tragedy and a beacon of hope. It highlighted the dangers faced by those who dared to challenge injustice, but it also showed the power of collective action. If one man's suffering could inspire millions to demand better, then perhaps the future wasn't as bleak as it sometimes seemed. Still, the journey was far from over. As the prosecutor continued his slow climb toward recovery, the legal battle loomed ahead. Would justice truly be served, or would the system fail him once again? Only time would tell. But for now, his courage and the support of countless strangers kept the flame of hope burning bright. As the prosecutor's condition slowly improved, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the events of that fateful night. Every detail mattered, every witness statement, every frame of surveillance footage, every scrap of evidence that could shed light on what really happened. It wasn't just about proving who was right or wrong. It was about uncovering the truth and ensuring that justice was served. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. The officer involved in the attack had a history that many people weren't aware of until now. Internal affairs records showed multiple complaints filed against him over the years. Complaints of excessive force, verbal abuse, and even racist remarks. None of these allegations had ever led to serious consequences for the officer. Some were dismissed outright, while others resulted in nothing more than a slap on the wrist. For victims of his behavior, this lack of accountability was infuriating. They felt like their voices didn't matter, like the system was designed to protect people in uniform no matter what they did. But this time, things were different. The prosecutor's case brought all those old complaints back into the spotlight. One woman came forward to share her story. Years ago, she had been pulled over by the same officer for a minor traffic violation. She said he used derogatory language toward her and threatened her when she asked why she was being stopped. Afraid of escalating the situation, she didn't file a formal complaint at the time. Now, hearing about what happened to the prosecutor, she regretted staying silent. "I should have spoken up," she said during an interview with local news. "Maybe if more of us had, this wouldn't have happened." Another man recounted how the officer had slammed him against his car during a routine check, leaving bruises that took weeks to heal. He filed a report, but nothing came of it. They told me it was standard procedure, he said bitterly. Standard procedure? Since when does protecting and serving mean hurting innocent people? These stories painted a troubling picture. It wasn't just one bad decision or one moment of anger. It was a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. And now, with the prosecutor lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, the stakes couldn't be higher. Investigators also dug deeper into the surveillance footage from the night of the attack. While the initial clips provided crucial context, forensic experts enhanced the video to reveal even more details. Frame by frame, they analyzed the officer's movements, his body language, and the way he interacted with the prosecutor. What they found left little room for doubt. The footage clearly showed the prosecutor complying with instructions, stepping out of his car calmly, keeping his hands visible, and making no sudden movements. There was no sign of resistance, no indication that he posed any kind of threat. Yet the officer lunged at him anyway, escalating the situation within seconds. Medical reports added another layer to the investigation. Doctors confirmed that the prosecutor's injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma caused by repeated strikes. His broken ribs, fractured bones, and head injury weren't the result of a single blow. They were the result of sustained, deliberate violence. This contradicted the officer's claim of self-defense, which relied heavily on portraying the prosecutor as a threat. How could someone so severely injured have possibly fought back? The prosecutor's colleagues played a key role in building the case against the officer. As federal prosecutors themselves, they understood the importance of gathering irrefutable evidence. They combed through years of data, looking for patterns in the officer's conduct. They reached out to other departments asking if similar complaints had been filed elsewhere. Slowly but surely, a clearer image emerged, one of a man who believed he was untouchable, operating above the law because no one had ever held him accountable. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from a former colleague of the officer. This person, who had worked alongside him for several years, described a toxic culture within their department. It wasn't just him, the former colleague said during a private meeting with investigators. There were others like him, officers, who thought they could do whatever they wanted because nobody would stop them. But he was worse. He thrived on intimidation. If you crossed him, you paid the price. This insider perspective gave investigators valuable insight into the mindset behind the attack. It wasn't random or spontaneous. It was calculated. The officer targeted the prosecutor not because of anything he did that night, but because of who he was. Someone who stood up for victims of police misconduct. Someone who challenged the status quo. Someone who refused to look the other way. Despite the mounting evidence, the defense team wasn't backing down. They argued that the prosecutor provoked the incident, suggesting he used his position to antagonize officers and make their jobs harder. They pointed to his career as proof, highlighting cases where he successfully prosecuted corrupt cops. To them, this was evidence of bias, not against the officer but against law enforcement as a whole. But the public wasn't buying it. Protesters continued to march, holding signs that read, "Accountability matters," and "Justice is not optional." Families shared their own experiences of mistreatment at the hands of police, adding fuel to the fire. Even some retired officers joined the conversation, calling for reform and urging their peers to take responsibility for the actions of those who tarnished the badge. For the prosecutor's family, the investigation was both a source of hope and immense frustration. On one hand, they were relieved to see progress being made. On the other, they couldn't help but feel angry about how long it had taken to address the officer's behavior. Why hadn't anyone acted sooner? How many lives had been ruined before this case finally forced people to pay attention? The prosecutor himself remained at the center of it all, though physically unable to participate. By now, he was awake and undergoing intense rehabilitation. Physical therapy sessions left him exhausted, but he pushed through the pain, determined to regain his strength. Speech therapists worked with him daily, helping him relearn how to communicate after weeks of silence. It was slow, painstaking work, but each small victory brought him closer to reclaiming his independence. His presence alone inspired those around him. Friends, family, and even strangers visited regularly, offering words of encouragement. Many told him how much his courage meant to them, that his willingness to stand up for justice, even at great personal cost, gave them hope for a better future. Others admitted they had doubted the system before, but now believed change was possible because of his example. As the investigation wrapped up, the focus shifted to the next phase: preparing for trial. Prosecutors knew they had a strong case, but they also understood the challenges ahead. Trials involving law enforcement officers often faced uphill battles with juries sometimes reluctant to convict. Public opinion could sway decisions, but it wasn't always enough to guarantee a fair outcome. Still, they were determined to try, knowing that the eyes of the nation would be watching. In the meantime, the prosecutor kept fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. His journey was far from over, but he had already become a symbol of resilience and determination. Whether he realized it or not, his story had ignited something bigger, a movement driven by ordinary people demanding extraordinary change. And as the legal battle loomed ahead, one thing was certain: the world was ready to listen. The trial began on a chilly morning, the kind where the air feels heavy with anticipation. The courtroom was packed to the brim. Lawyers, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens filled every available seat. Some had traveled from far away, just to witness what many were calling the trial of the century. Outside, protesters gathered holding signs that read, "Justice can't wait," and "No more excuses." Their chants echoed through the streets, a reminder that this wasn't just about one case, it was about something much bigger. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecutor, still recovering from his injuries, sat in a wheelchair at the front of the room. His presence alone commanded respect, but it also served as a stark reminder of the brutality he endured. He looked thinner than before, his face marked by scars, both visible and invisible. Yet despite everything he'd been through, there was an undeniable strength in his eyes, a quiet determination that refused to be extinguished. For him, this trial wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever felt powerless against those meant to protect them. The officer accused of the attack sat stoically beside his defense team, his expression unreadable. Dressed in a neatly pressed suit, he seemed calm, almost detached, as if the weight of the charges hadn't fully sunk in. But those who knew him well might have noticed the slightest twitch in his jaw, or the way he avoided making eye contact with the prosecutor. Whether it was guilt, fear, or simply arrogance, no one could say for sure. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, laying out the facts of the case in clear, unflinching terms. They described the events of that night, the traffic stop, the racial slurs, the unprovoked violence, and presented evidence piece by piece. Surveillance footage played on a large screen, showing the prosecutor stepping out of his car calmly, only to be dragged to the ground moments later. Medical reports followed, detailing the extent of his injuries and confirming they were caused by deliberate force. Witnesses took the stand, recounting what they saw and heard, their voices steady but laced with emotion. One particularly gripping moment came when a neighbor testified. She spoke softly but firmly, describing how she had watched the attack unfold from her window. "I'll never forget the sound," she said, her voice trembling. "It was like someone hitting a bag over and over again. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, frozen." Her words hung in the air, raw and haunting, leaving not a single dry eye in the room. The defense countered with arguments designed to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. They claimed the officer acted in self-defense, insisting the prosecutor had resisted arrest and escalated the situation. They questioned the credibility of witnesses, suggesting some might have exaggerated what they saw. At times, their tone bordered on dismissive, as though implying the entire case was nothing more than a smear campaign against law enforcement. But the cracks in their strategy began to show almost immediately. Cross-examinations revealed inconsistencies in the officer's account of events. When asked why he used such excessive force, he struggled to provide a coherent answer. He was resisting, he repeated, though the surveillance footage clearly showed otherwise. Under pressure, his composure started to falter. Tiny details, an evasive glance, a hesitant pause, spoke volumes, chipping away at his credibility bit by bit. The prosecution also introduced damning internal records from the police department. These documents exposed years of misconduct complaints against the officer, painting a picture of someone who operated with impunity. One particularly explosive revelation involved a memo written by a superior officer warning about his aggressive behavior. "This individual has a history of using unnecessary force during routine stops," the memo read. "Further incidents could result in significant liability for the department." Despite these warnings, no disciplinary action was taken. As the days wore on, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. Tears flowed freely during emotional testimonies, while heated exchanges between lawyers sparked bursts, agents. As the trial entered its final stages, tensions inside the courtroom reached a boiling point. The prosecution had laid out their case with precision, presenting evidence that painted a damning picture of the officer's actions. Surveillance footage, medical reports, witness testimonies, and internal records all pointed to one undeniable truth. The attack was unprovoked, brutal, and driven by prejudice. Yet the defense wasn't backing down. They clung to their narrative, arguing that the prosecutor had somehow provoked the incident and that the officer's response, though excessive, was justified under the circumstances. The closing arguments were where the battle truly came to a head. The prosecutor's legal team delivered a fiery speech, reminding the jury of the stakes involved. "This isn't just about one man," they said, their voices steady but filled with emotion. "It's about accountability. It's about trust. When someone puts on a uniform, they take an oath to serve and protect. But what happens when that trust is broken? What happens when those sworn to uphold the law instead use it as a weapon?" They emphasized the prosecutor's courage in pursuing justice despite knowing the risks. "He didn't ask for this fight," they continued, "but he stood up anyway because he believed in fairness. He believed in doing what's right. And now, he sits here today, not as a victim, but as a symbol of hope. Hope that we can build a system where no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it." The defense countered with a polished but increasingly desperate argument. They appealed to the jury's sense of reason, urging them not to let public pressure influence their decision. "We're not here to debate policing practices or social issues," the lead defense attorney said. "We're here to determine whether my client acted within the bounds of his duty. Was there resistance? Yes. Did he respond accordingly? Absolutely. You cannot convict him based on emotions or headlines. This is about facts, plain and simple." But the jury didn't seem convinced. Throughout the trial, they had watched intently, taking notes and observing every detail. Some jurors exchanged glances during the defense's closing remarks, subtle gestures that suggested skepticism. Others stared straight ahead, their expressions unreadable but their focus unwavering. Whatever verdict they reached, it was clear they took their responsibility seriously. After hours of deliberation behind closed doors, the jury finally returned with their decision. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood to read the verdict. Every eye was fixed on them, every breath held. When the word guilty rang out, a collective gasp swept through the room. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then, slowly, applause broke out among the spectators. Some cried openly, while others hugged each other tightly, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. The judge wasted no time delivering the sentence. Known for her tough stance on cases involving abuse of power, she addressed the court with a stern voice. "Law enforcement officers are entrusted with immense authority," she said, her tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "With that authority comes the responsibility to act with integrity, fairness, and restraint. Instead, you chose to wield your power as a tool of oppression. Your actions were not only criminal, but a betrayal of everything a police officer is supposed to represent." She sentenced the officer to the maximum penalty allowed by law, 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. It was one of the harshest sentences ever handed down to a police officer in modern history. As bailiffs escorted him out of the courtroom, his face remained blank, though his hands trembled slightly as they cuffed him. Outside, cheers erupted from the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. Strangers embraced, tears streaming down their faces as chants of "justice served" echoed into the night. For the prosecutor, the verdict brought a mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a deep sadness. He knew the scars, both physical and emotional, would stay with him forever. Sitting in his wheelchair, surrounded by loved ones, he allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't a victory lap. It was acknowledgement that the fight hadn't been in vain. His wife leaned over and whispered, "You did it." He nodded faintly, too exhausted to speak. In the days following the trial, the nation grappled with what had happened. News outlets dissected every aspect of the case, from the brutality of the attack to the unprecedented sentence. Pundits debated whether this marked a turning point in how society viewed police misconduct. Would other officers think twice before abusing their power? Or would this remain an isolated example of justice prevailing? For many, the answer lay in the broader impact of the case. Activists saw it as a catalyst for change, proof that sustained pressure could yield results. They organized rallies, town halls, and workshops aimed at addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. Petitions calling for reforms, mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, stricter accountability measures, gained traction online. Even lawmakers began drafting legislation inspired by the case, signaling a potential shift in policy. But for the prosecutor and his family, life started to settle into a new rhythm. Physical therapy sessions continued, each day bringing small improvements. Speech therapy helped him regain confidence in communicating, though speaking still required effort. Friends and colleagues visited often, sharing stories and laughter to lift his spirits. Slowly but surely, he began to imagine a future beyond the courtroom. One afternoon, as he sat in his living room flipping through channels, he stumbled upon a news segment featuring interviews with people affected by police violence. Their words resonated deeply with him. "I never thought I'd see something like this happen," one woman said, tears welling up in her eyes. "It gives me hope that maybe things can get better." Her comment struck a chord. Despite everything he'd endured, the prosecutor realized his story wasn't just about pain. It was about possibility. If his suffering could inspire others to demand change, then perhaps it wasn't in vain. That realization fueled his determination to keep going, to keep pushing for progress. By now, the bruises had faded and some of the physical wounds had healed, but the emotional toll lingered, manifesting in sleepless nights and moments of quiet reflection. Still, he refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he channeled his energy into advocacy work, joining forces with organizations dedicated to reforming law enforcement practices. He spoke at conferences, wrote op-eds, and met with policymakers, using his platform to amplify voices that had long been ignored. His journey wasn't easy, nor was it quick. There were setbacks along the way, days when frustration threatened to overwhelm him, when the weight of the world felt unbearable. But he pressed on, buoyed by the knowledge that he wasn't alone. Countless individuals, from family members to strangers halfway across the globe, had rallied around him, offering support and solidarity. And so, the prosecutor's story became more than just a tale of survival. It evolved into a testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light can break through. Whether or not lasting change followed remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The fight had begun, and it wouldn't end anytime soon. Months passed after the trial, and while the headlines eventually faded, the impact of what had happened continued to ripple through society. The prosecutor's story didn't end with the verdict. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would shape the lives of countless others. Though he still carried the scars of that fateful night, both visible and invisible, his resolve only grew stronger. He wasn't content to simply move on. He wanted to make sure no one else had to endure what he went through. A new mission. The prosecutor knew firsthand how broken the system could be. He understood the fear people felt when they encountered law enforcement, not because they'd done something wrong, but because they worried about being treated unfairly. So instead of retreating into private life, he dedicated himself to creating change. With the help of close friends and colleagues, he founded a nonprofit organization aimed at addressing police misconduct and supporting victims of abuse. The group worked tirelessly to provide resources for those seeking justice, from legal aid to counseling services. One of their first initiatives was a hotline where people could report incidents of police brutality anonymously. They also launched educational campaigns to teach communities how to document interactions with officers safely and effectively. These efforts weren't glamorous or easy, but they were vital. Every phone call, every workshop, every pamphlet distributed was a step toward accountability, a way to ensure that stories like his wouldn't be ignored in the future. Inspiring others. What made the prosecutor's advocacy so powerful was his authenticity. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges ahead, nor did he pretend to have all the answers. Instead, he shared his own struggles openly, speaking candidly about the pain, frustration, and moments of doubt he faced during his recovery. His vulnerability resonated with people. It reminded them that even heroes aren't invincible, and that fighting for justice often comes at a personal cost. He traveled across the country, giving talks at schools, community centers, and conferences. At each stop, he met individuals whose lives had been touched by similar injustices. Some came forward to share their stories publicly for the first time, emboldened by his example. Others quietly thanked him, tears streaming down their faces, saying things like, "You gave me hope," or "I thought I was alone until I heard you speak." These encounters reinforced why he kept going. Each person he met became part of a growing network of voices demanding reform. Together, they formed a coalition united not by anger or revenge, but by a shared desire for fairness and dignity. Pushing for policy change. While grassroots efforts were crucial, the prosecutor also recognized the importance of systemic change. He teamed up with lawmakers and activists to push for legislative reforms at local, state, and national levels. One of their key priorities was establishing independent oversight boards to investigate complaints against police officers. Unlike internal affairs departments, these boards would include members of the community, ensuring transparency and accountability. They also advocated for mandatory body cameras for all officers, arguing that video evidence could prevent disputes over what really happened during encounters. Training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity became another priority. "We can't fix everything overnight," the prosecutor said during a press conference. "But we can start by making sure officers are better equipped to handle situations without resorting to violence." Not everyone agreed with these proposals. Critics argued that such measures would place undue burdens on law enforcement, making it harder for them to do their jobs. But supporters countered that protecting citizens and holding officers accountable weren't mutually exclusive goals. They were two sides of the same coin. Facing resistance. Despite the progress being made, resistance remained fierce. Some police unions fought back against reform efforts, claiming they were unnecessary and unfair. Online trolls launched smear campaigns against the prosecutor, accusing him of exaggerating his injuries or using the case for personal gain. Even within his own circle, there were moments of tension. Friends worried about his safety, urging him to step back before he burned himself out. Colleagues cautioned him against taking on too much, reminding him that he was still healing. But the prosecutor refused to back down. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but he also believed that lasting change required persistence. "If I stop now," he told a close friend one evening, "then what was all this for? What was the point of surviving if I don't use my voice to help others?" His determination inspired those around him to dig deeper. Volunteers poured their energy into organizing events, drafting petitions, and lobbying officials. Donations poured in from people who wanted to support the cause. Slowly but surely, momentum built, not just in one city or state, but nationwide. A legacy of hope years later, When historians looked back on this era, they saw it as a turning point. The prosecutor's case had sparked a movement that transcended borders and demographics. It wasn't perfect. There were still setbacks, still injustices, but the tide was shifting. More cases of police misconduct were being investigated thoroughly. Officers found guilty of wrongdoing were facing consequences, however rare. And perhaps most importantly, conversations about race, power, and accountability were happening in ways they never had before. For the prosecutor, the greatest reward wasn't fame or recognition. It was knowing he'd played a role in planting seeds of change. He often reflected on how far he'd come since that brutal night. There were days when standing up felt impossible, when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush him. Yet every time he faltered, someone reached out to remind him why it mattered. Whether it was a child drawing a picture of a superhero labeled Justice Man, or a grandmother thanking him for giving her faith in humanity again, these small acts of kindness fueled his spirit. In interviews, he always emphasized that the work wasn't his alone. "This is bigger than me," he'd say. "It's about all of us coming together to create a world where everyone feels safe and valued. That's what justice means. Not punishment, but fairness. Not division, but unity." Looking ahead, as the years went by, the prosecutor gradually stepped back from the spotlight. His health, though improved, still required careful management, and he knew it was important to let younger voices take the lead. But he never stopped advocating. He mentored aspiring lawyers, wrote books about his experiences, and stayed involved in policy discussions whenever possible. On quiet evenings, he liked to sit outside and watch the sunset. Sometimes he'd think about that night, the flashing lights, the shouting, the pain, and marvel at how far he'd come. Other times he'd reflect on the people he'd met along the way, each carrying their own burdens and dreams. Through it all, one thing remained clear. The fight for justice wasn't over. It might never truly be over. But as long as people kept believing in the possibility of a better tomorrow, there was hope. And hope, he realized, was the most powerful force of all.